Hello, and welcome to the first module of High Ability and MTSS Systemic Integration Training. The goal of these modules is to build capacity and understanding of integrating high ability learning into your existing MTSS frameworks. This module will be an introduction to high ability learners and the natural connections between high ability services and MTSS. Before we jump into the content, it's important that we understand the context. We're here to improve services for all students, which is why we need systemic MTSS integration. This data will show us the need for change to our current systems. And while some of this data is specific to Nebraska, there are similar problems with gifted and talented learning across the country. I like to start by defining high ability learner so that we are all working from a common definition. In Nebraska, we have Rule 3, which is the rule that governs high ability learning. In that rule, a high ability student is defined as a learner with high performance capability, giving evidence of that in areas such as intellectual, creative, artistic, or specific academic domains. And they require some kind of accelerated or differentiated curriculum to help them develop those capabilities fully. This is the commonly used definition in Nebraska, but each district is also able to adopt their own. The next definition I would like to share comes from the National Association for Gifted Children. This definition is widely used by scholars, advocates, and researchers in gifted education, and it expands the definition to include students who display not only high performance capability, but high performance potential. As we know, we have a lot of students with unrecognized potential, especially our students from historically marginalized backgrounds. They also point out that peers of the same age and context should be used for comparison. A high ability student in a rural area may have different strengths and look different than a HAL student in an urban area. It does not mean that one of them is not a high ability learner. It just means that everything should be taken in context. One question that arises is, why is high ability education important? It is a common myth that students who are high ability will be fine on their own. They'll hit the grade level standards, they have good test scores at the end of the year. And while this may be true, as we move into looking at data through a growth lens versus a standards-based lens, it changes and challenges our perspectives of high ability learners. As you can see on this graph, this was a study done in 2008 and repeated again in 2020. This graph represents students in grades 3 through 8 and their test scores during the years they were tracked. Along the bottom, you can see the 3rd through 8th grade years, and along the side axis, you can see their test score. Student A comes to us in 3rd grade well above proficient. They probably know most of the material being taught, or they can learn it in about half the time in that of their peers. Historically, because these students are above proficient, we have not provided interventions, and they are sitting in the gen ed classroom with maybe 45 minutes of high ability a week, if they're lucky. They're not being challenged. And when they're going unchallenged, they're not learning something new every day. And they're unlikely to make a year's worth of growth for a year's worth of instruction. They settle into a pattern of regression, but they're still above that proficient line. So this has not previously been cause for concern. On the other hand, we have student B who comes in at 3rd grade well below grade level. This student is immediately flagged and they are receiving intervention supports, possibly diagnosed with a learning disability, and we even have legislative acts, such as the Nebraska Reading Act, that are designed to help these students. With supports, they're able to make growth. Maybe they don't quite make it to that proficient line, or maybe they do, but student B absolutely deserves those interventions and those supports so that they can grow. But what do we do with student A? Student A also deserves for their line to look like student B and to make a year's worth of growth for a year's worth of instruction. That is where this pilot comes in. But what about in Nebraska? In 2021, we gathered high ability learning data in a variety of areas and compiled what we call the Equity in HAL State Report. This can be found on the Nebraska Department of Education's website under the High Ability Learning section if you would like to see the full report. The data used was from the 2018-19 school year, as this was the most reliable data year we had available at the time. The first metric we looked at was achievement. We took the 3rd through 8th grade NSCAS scores for all students labeled as a high ability learner in Nebraska. We found that only 49% of our HAL identified students scored at the college and career ready benchmark in ELA, and only 36% in math. High ability learners are generally identified via a test score, and a lot of schools use the 90th plus percentile. So this means on average that our high ability students, the ones we would expect to score the highest, by the time they're going 3rd through 8th grade, they are not hitting the most advanced levels on standardized testing. Similarly, for HAL identified 11th grade students, the data shows similar. ACT defines their readiness benchmark as students being equipped to enroll and succeed in a credit-bearing first-year course without remediation. They project that students hitting this readiness benchmark have a 75% chance of receiving a C or higher. Students who are not at the readiness benchmark, or defined as approaching by ACT, are likely to be able to access some coursework without remediation, not all, or receive a poor grade in first-year courses when they are enrolled for credit-bearing purposes. This means that our HAL identified students, again, the ones we would expect to be prepared for post-secondary, are not as prepared for college-level coursework as we predicted. This can stem from lack of development in the early grades and access to advanced academics in secondary settings. Another challenge, not only in Nebraska, but across the country, is identifying high ability learners equitably. As you can see, this yellow line is what we call a target ratio, and that is about having balanced representation in high ability programs. For example, if your student population is 15% Black, your HAL program should also be 15% Black. That one-to-one representation is the target, and as we can see, we have over and underrepresented populations in Nebraska. It is important to note that we do not have accurate Native Hawaiian or Pacific Islander data. This has to be taken out of our data set. It cannot be shown to be true. Our white and Asian students are often admitted into HAL programs at a higher rate, and our Black, Native, and Hispanic students are underrepresented by as much as 60%. Similarly, when we group the students differently, we do not identify high ability students from low income backgrounds, students with special education eligibility, and especially our English language learners. Of almost 9,000 EL students in Nebraska, only 30 in the entire state are identified as high ability learners. We also looked at graduation rates. As you can see, HAL students are graduating at a higher rate compared to the state average, which is generally around 87%. However, our high ability students who are identified and are part of one of these groups have lower graduation rates. High ability learners, again, are generally identified via a test score, and a lot of schools use that 90th plus percentile in the elementary grades. So even our highest performing migrant and highly mobile students who at some point have scored high enough to be labeled a high ability learner are graduating at startlingly low rates. The HAL in special education and English language learner graduation rate is close to the state average, but they are 10 to 14% lower than our non-English language and non-special education high ability population. So what causes these inequities in HAL programs? Long-standing and common practices in gifted education provide challenges and barriers to providing high-quality services across the country. First and foremost, gifted education does not have many well-known and sustainable frameworks. As we know, it is hard to meet student needs when we do not have a system in place to do so. Next is the lack of accountability and evaluation of HAL programs. In the US, only 4 states produce a report on gifted education, and only 11 states report gifted students as a subgroup on state report card. Nebraska does not have either of these. Minimal reporting and accountability for how perpetuates the issue of unknown effectiveness and tangible change for those students. Finally, there's a lack of understanding surrounding high ability education. Professional development for teachers, administrators, and districts is sparse, and many districts do not have a high ability trained teacher. In the entire state of Nebraska, we have 131 teachers with an active high ability endorsement. This means that they have taken graduate level coursework and meet the requirements set forth by the state. Of those 131 teachers, more than half are located in the Omaha and Lincoln area. On a map, we can see the high concentration of endorsements in some areas, but we have large portions of our state's districts that do not have a person who has taken coursework in high ability learning. This is not uncommon, but it can limit access to knowledge and appropriate services for our high ability students. The question becomes, so what do we do? And that's why you're here. The first step is to acknowledge that your district wants to do more for high ability students. Signing up to be part of this pilot is one of those. This module will be an introduction to high ability learners and the natural connections made between high ability and MTSS. The goal of this module is to lay foundation and create a clear understanding of integrating high ability services into your existing MTSS framework. The objectives are to connect the current use of MTSS to the advanced academic needs, identify common cognitive, academic, and SEBL characteristics of our high ability learners, and understand how those characteristics manifest in the classroom. Please continue through the rest of the module to learn more about high ability and MTSS integration.